Hello, Salt Lake City. Welcome to Talk with Ted, number 40. And I've got with me Moe Hickey. Is that how we say it, Mo? Mo, I'm going to have you move over here. We're going to put you on hold here for a little bit. I'm trying to get my Facebook Live going, Alan. We're going to be off to a slow start here for 1 second. It snuck up on me, the time.
Yeah.
But it's 4:03. Beautiful Tuesday afternoon here in Salt Lake City. Clouds in the sky. We're moving into the second phase of summer, the last phase. And that'll be back to school. And so today my guest is a New York native who's also a transplant like me. Mo's got a history with big finance back in New York and then a transplant out here to Salt Lake City, Park City. He's been with the Park City Institute on the Park City School Board and is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Voices for Utah Children, which is an advocacy group based here in Salt Lake City that has got its tentacles in a variety of issues designed at improving the lives of children. So it's kind of like the family court standard. Mo, we're going to talk about the judicial system. I got you on mute right now, so we're going to keep you on hold. But the grand standard in family court is best interest of the children. And I think that's what we, humanity, needs to sort of keep in mind. And so the show today will be focused on sort of what's in the best interest of the children. And it is episode 40. I've been lucky to be doing this show for 6-8 months now. I'm trying to start a YouTube channel. I'm going to launch that soon, so hopefully we'll get a few subscriptions if I get any of my friends back in Goshen, New York. I always got my mom tuning in. I'll have at least one subscriber. And it's going to be a little bit of leap of faith, see if I can't get some people on board and try to make something of this radio show. Last week, I had a great guest, Terry Fossum, Captain Terry Fossum, retired commander of the United States Air Force. If you missed that, you can go back to the K-Talk Media website and catch that. But Terry was a great guest, and we were talking about racism and the Boy Scouts and the Eagle Scout honor, the importance of trying to reach that higher standard that the Boy Scouts of America holds itself out to. I'm doing two things at once. I'm now trying to start my Facebook Live. And current events. And I got that going on the background. That's not good. But I had made a comparison last week, an analogy, if you will, about with racism, to take a look at Haiti and the history of Haiti and how I think the world can learn from that and Washington, D.C. can learn from that. And, I got thinking since I mentioned that last week about this notion of racism. And it's an interesting issue, an important issue, and none of us want to be racists. None of us want to be tagged with that label of being racist. And, we've all seen the bumper sticker, nobody's born a racist. And I think that there's some truth to that. But if you open your mind to the possibility of maybe another potential theory is that maybe we're not born clean and we've all got a little bit of racist in us. And maybe if we took that approach, that rather than trying to vilify and deny and put labels on each other, that if we approached it from sort of a historical, more understanding perspective, that, as we converge on one another in this world, especially in the United States of America through our integrated political system, that we greet each other with a little more respect and understanding. We try to understand the other side a little bit more. And so maybe we're not all quite as pure as we like to believe we are. And so just food for thought, maybe approaching that conversation from a different angle. On another thought, I was contacted over the weekend by Professor Amos Giora, who I had on the program, law professor here at the University of Utah, who, to start the show, my very first guest, because he'd authored a book, The Crime of Complicity, about a bystander in the Holocaust, and sort of that's in the theme of the Seinfeld show and my radio show. And Professor Giora reached out to me and he'll be back in Utah in mid-August, and I'm going to have him back on because he's got a couple of projects going, including a new book about international relations and religious extremism, and as well as an article that's set to come out in the American Bar Association. And I don't know if this is going to grow into something more, but he's basically taken his proposition of the duty to rescue in the context of, seeing someone in a perilous position, and whether there's a duty to call 911 and whether there should be a criminal basis for that. And I've kind of taken that little example and applied it to a broader context in terms of global warming, saying, don't we all have an obligation to kind of help each other from this existential threat of global warming and the world we've created. But Professor Giora is studying this question of the duty to rescue or report wrongdoing in the context of sexual abuse against minors. And I'm going to read just a couple of excerpts of what he shared with me. And we're going to have him on as a guest when he comes back after August 18th. Based on thousands of pages of grand jury indictments, civil lawsuits, criminal prosecutions, special reports, media accounts, and personal interaction with sexual assault survivors and their attorneys, Amos Giora poses one critical question. What are the victim's expectations of the enabler bystander? And I spoke to him about this a little bit, just the context of where there's, someone in a home that knows that there's that activity going on. And I find that to just be such an outrageous example of where there should be a basis for criminal liability. And he's studying that from the victim's perspective and sort of the desperate cry for help. And because that didn't happen, the perpetrator benefited from the complicit cowardice of the enabler. The book emphasizes individual and institutional enablers alike. In fact, armies of enablers. From the victim's perspective, both bear responsibility for their plight and must be held accountable. And so interesting forthcoming analysis by Professor Giora, and we're going to have him on to explain that. I'm also going to have my cousin Jeff McBride back on. Shout out to my cousin Jeff McBride. What do you got, Alan? No. And I just find Amos's article interesting in light of the timing with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and sort of, Sex Island and that big problem. But there are sort of people on the ground, looking to protect people, children in particular. That's how this ties into Moe today. And there's a lot of people in Utah trying to do positive things for children. And I spoke about a Utah company, Maloof, furniture maker in Logan, Utah, and they've partnered with a Silicon Valley company, Podium, software maker. And they've combined to donate a portion of their sales to the proceeds or profits to the Underground Railroad to help in the identification and prosecution of those and saving victims of sex trafficking, because I think it's really a terrible plight. But I'm going to have Matt Vance from Maloof Foundation on to highlight that great work. And hopefully that'll tie in a bit to today as well. Moe here, we're going to get to him in a few more minutes, but is with Voices of Utah Children. And he's going to tell us about that a nonprofit company, not tied to the capitalist system. But I think it's really time for corporate America to step up to try to provide better opportunities for people. I'm going to sound like a broken record. I've done this before, but I see it playing out in the border crisis. And I'm going to have on the program my friend Leslie Templeton, who's a student at Boston College, I believe, but she is a activist and currently with a group doing a documentary in Texas, studying conditions at the border and trying to do it in a way that looks at all issues from a way that doesn't get covered by the mainstream press. And one of their goals, Alan, is to actually go down into Mexico and to look at the border, Mexico's southern border, with Guatemala, which I find particularly interesting, because I've got a nephew adopted from Guatemala. But I think that's interesting, and to have politicians and religious leaders and activists, human services providers examine the issue from all sides. And I spoke with them last week, and incredibly, one of the challenges that even the sort of volunteer community faces is the distribution of supplies and items, and they're trying to coordinate what the needs are of people in camps on both sides of the border, and to try to direct resources to them, and to examine the issue from a sort of world perspective. So I'm going to have Leslie on. You can't help but think then this week, looming in the news, of course, everyone has seen it. Last week I was talking about Baltimore and poverty, and this week, of course, there were the shootings in El Paso, Texas, as well as Dayton, Ohio. And so we see the rhetoric back out again, and accusations and blame of, who's at fault for what, and what rhetoric has contributed to what actions. And so we're at it again. But I think that we really need to examine the systems that are producing these children of ours, rather than looking at even the individual, because it keeps popping up. It's just been it's our epidemic, and I think that we need the world's help to address it. That we have a fundamental problem with the development of our youth, in that far too often they're growing up to feel entitled somehow, whether it's morally, socially, economically, or desperate, but that they feel that they can take the law into their own hands and be the judge, jury, and executor on a variety of things. And you just got to ask what's going through their minds that's leading one after the other to do this. And to me, I see a little bit of similarity in their actions with how our governments acted back at the time of even World War II, because there was hysteria back then, and people thought they'd identified the devil in their opponent. And everybody acted, from a position of moral high ground. Hitler himself had convinced large swaths of folks that was the case. And we really saw the damage that fundamentalism and limited beliefs and where that led. And what I see now is sort of a world restraint. The governments of the world were fortunate enough to live in relative peace, that no one's unleashed those nuclear bombs. But our rhetoric hasn't really changed, and the way that we attack each other and don't listen to each other hasn't really changed. And I think that part of this, the mass shootings, et cetera, is a flare-up. A combination of things, lack of opportunity for young people, growing up in a disillusioned world where they think that the whole world's full of hypocrites, or only they can bring the solutions that they see espoused out there in some sort of extreme form. But I think we've got to ask ourselves, how are we molding these young people where they feel that they're entitled somehow to go out and do that. I don't know how we're going to begin to answer that, but I want to highlight a couple of things before segue into Moe. Back to the racist issues. President Trump is in the news, and declaring that, he'd like to bring an end to the violence. Naturally, I think we all can echo that sentiment. And in his statement, President Trump declared, in one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. And so I'm going to read that again, because let's just take him at his literal word, as they like to do with some of his tweets. But let's just accept this one at face value. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. For some, you read the political articles, they're still hurling around the labels at one another. But former President Obama posted a statement in which he called for the nation to, quote, soundly reject language coming out of the mouths of any of our leaders that feeds a climate of fear and hatred or normalizes racist statements. And I applaud President Obama for that statement, and I think that it is a broad blanket statement beyond what President Trump had to say to really stop the racist argument. We've just got to stop it. And we've got to learn to get along. And part of that getting along is trying to figure out the solution to our problems. So naturally, the shootings in El Paso and Dayton raise the question of the Second Amendment and gun control. And it's a very difficult issue because people ultimately want to be able to protect themselves in their homes. And that's really the predicate basis, in my judgment, for that Second Amendment protection, that they want that basic protection because historically, you look at history, they need that gun because there are people coming that want to take away their beliefs or limit their opportunities. And so it's a very difficult question, this right to bear arms. And in Utah, it's being played out here, right here in Utah. The question becomes, if there's someone with a mental illness or expressing some ideologies or tendencies that they may commit some violent act, is there some obligation by someone that witnesses that to step forward? I think in the Dayton shooter, there was a girlfriend with whom the assailant had shared certain thoughts with. So it's not uncommon that happens. And then is there a legal mechanism to try to disarm that person if that person has a gun? And in Utah here, it is, it's called broadly the red flag law. And there's been some attempts here in Utah to pass that law, and President Trump, I believe, don't hold me to this, but I believe that he just indicated some support for that. And so that, can kind of cut both ways. And so what it basically does is provides close family members, to be designated in the statute. I haven't read the statute, but it's going to be a close family member, someone that's lived with a person for more than 6 months, who's in a position, to have some reliable firsthand information and hopefully, some closer connections to report that. But that would enable them to go to court to basically have a judge sign off on an order to go confiscate that person's weapons. And so I find the Second Amendment interesting. What's the liberal position and what's the conservative position? It's evolved over time, but it is the Second Amendment. It's a liberal right granted to protect, individual rights. But it's this ultimate balance. And some people think that it will be abused to stigmatize mental illness with violence, or will be abused to lead to the issuance of too many orders to take guns from innocent people, and can our judicial system even be trusted with such a task? But they are proposing that here in Utah. And again, you can talk about the NRA, the moral right to defend yourself, the need to have a gun. It raises all of those questions, but I think that the answer lies not so much in that mechanism to take away the guns, but in addressing sort of the core issues of our youth that lead them to resort to that in the first place. one of the things that leads to that, and some people say racism, but another thing that can lead to that anger or that extremism or fostering that sense of moral indignation that I'm just going to take the law in my own hands and go kill whoever I think I can shoot up. But one of the things that leads to that can be even Christian extremism. And whether, the United States of America is a predominantly Christian country, or does it have some God-given right to have a Christian destiny? And I think that that is an interesting question because it ties to white supremacy. And does religious fundamentalism, or Canada Christian fundamentalism, play a role in that? And as I was thinking about that, I was scrolling the internet, and lo and behold, I find an article on my trusted source, KSL, but this is actually from the Deseret News. And the Deseret News is also where I got the article on Moe here. They had highlighted your receiving the appointment as the CEO of Voices for Utah Children. But this article is entitled, "What is White Nationalism and What Does It Have to Do with Religion?" And it's really kind of a repetition of what I just said, but I'm going to repeat it anyway because I think it's worth repeating. And it's worth noting that it's here in Utah on the Deseret News website, which, anybody in Utah knows that is the predominant LDS controlled or owned media outlet, media equivalent of a Catholic newspaper. But in it, there's an interview by Kelsey Dallas, and the interview is just, I think, yesterday, with a professor of sociology, Andrew Whitehead, at Clemson University. And the question is, and it's in today's Deseret News. You can also see it on KSL.com because I won't do it justice. But it's basically, they discuss how white nationalists believe whites deserve privileged status in the United States, and Christian nationalists believe Christians deserve the same. Both ideologies stand in the way of unity. And so they're tying the, obviously the racism to sort of the religious intolerance. And, it's an interesting thing here in Utah because, and I've spoken about this the last couple of weeks, Utah's history plays a unique role, in the preservation of religious beliefs. And take out the word religious, the preservation of beliefs. You could believe whatever you want, but they played a critical role in that. And I think that that's what's playing out with Colin Kaepernick in football. We've got to respect those beliefs. And maybe the discussion about who's a racist is just fueling this wild insecurity for kids growing up. But they go on in this article, and it's a short interview, where they talk about a third of the American population are Christian and think that it's a very important part of America, being Christian. And I think that that's an identity that's probably pretty hard for a lot of people to let go of, or to share, I should say. Because I think the United States of America, the melting pot, was never designed to be co-opted by a single church. In fact, just the opposite was true, where it was, liberated from the Church of England. But they just go on to identify here, the importance of recognizing, I think it's no matter how good your intentions and your beliefs, that we all have the potential of sharing or becoming a part of that culture that is defining itself by just this extreme rhetoric. And in this article, they talk about being pulled along that moving walkway, that we kind of become engaged in that Christian nationalism without even meaning to sort of do so. And so I just say kudos to the state of Utah for recognizing that there's a place for everybody to be heard. I think that Utah's a great lesson for the world. It's sort of a new melting pot this day and age with the world coming here, of course, for the Olympics and now Silicon Slopes and hopefully the Olympics again. But I want to give a real shout out to another positive thing going on here in Utah. Last week, it was announced that the state has funded, and I think it's through the University of Utah, an opioid bridge recovery program where they will fund drug rehab for opiates, I think a one-time deal for anyone in the state that doesn't have insurance that can't afford it. And there's some incredible things going on here. Last year in Utah, or 2017, 456 people died of opioid drug overdose. And in the short period of time that this program has been in operation, in 3 months, 75 lives have been saved, according to Dr. Peter Talak, emergency room physician at the University of Utah Hospital. And to give you an idea of the severity of the drug problem and overdose and suicide, Dr. Talak said that this program has the potential to save more lives than anything else in the hospital on any given day. Wow. And so think about that. And so Utah, a great example here. I know that they've been highlighted. The Attorney General, Sean Reyes, is, I know, in contact with Stuart Goffman, who we had on the show a couple of months ago. And Stuart is the creative director of a program that will air on A&E television on August 17th called Addiction Unplugged. And he goes around and highlights sort of all the positive things that people are doing surrounding that problem, re-engagement into the community, and positive aspects of that. So tune in to Addiction Unplugged. You'll see Utah featured in it, and hopefully Stuart will be back here in Utah to feature some more. Just as to try to segue it into a little bit of humor, well, I've got coming on here, where's his card? Drew Reese. And Drew, I just met for the second time, but Drew has a radio program here called Comic Church, and kind of poking fun at all the churches and pop culture and sparing no one, trying to raise awareness for some issues. So I'm going to be talking to Drew. And it just got me thinking a little bit. I just need to sum it up with this, try to segue into a little bit of humor to get to Moe. But everybody knows the Book of Mormon movie and the South Park guys. Some people may not know that the South Park creators are, I think, former LDS guys themselves. But the Book of Mormon movie is back in Utah, and it's actually at the Eccles Theater at the University of Utah, running from August 13th until the 25th, a couple of week run. And I remember when that came out, I was a little bit alarmed by it. I thought that's a little bit too much. Kind of South Park can kind of make fun of everyone, but then why did they go out of their way to make the movie? But I think that it's a welcome thing here, even in Utah. Given the history of the LDS culture, that they can certainly take a good-natured joke. And if somebody wants to come and poke fun at them, as long as you're not taking away their right to believe in what they believe in, I think that's okay. With that, I was hoping that my daughter was going to be here. I don't know if she's outside or not. We'll check her on the next commercial. But I was going to have my daughter answer a few questions about camp and the perspective from a kid. But we all sort of know it already. The kids are scared these days. And let's turn Moe on. The kids are scared these days. And it's... let's get your mic on there. And it's a scary world, and they need a voice and a detached voice. And I've got just tapping in now as I think that voice himself, Moe Hickey. How are you, Mo?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Tim.
I'm out of breath. You want to take over?
Where do we want to go?
New York. I love having another New Yorker on.
Yeah, if I only still had an accent.
I don't know if I've ever had one. I try to have people guess where I'm from.
Mine comes out when my friends are visiting. My kids will tell me that I become a New Yorker overnight again.
Is that right?
Yeah, when former friends come out to visit and ski.
Mine's when I get mad.
That too. They probably don't want to highlight that. So, but yeah, born and raised in New York. I was from Manhattan. Grew up in Manhattan. Went to college in New York. Started my first career, I guess I could call it, in the financial markets in New York, and subsequently then traveled probably for the next 20 years on the international route overseas, and finished up back in New York when I thought I was retiring the first time.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What year was that? You say finished?
That was 2000. So I had, after I finished school, I started in international finance in Manhattan. I transferred from there out to Los Angeles, opened up the West Coast operations. Then spent a couple of years in Japan. We were negotiating a merger with a Japanese partner. Once we completed
So you must know what Mo means in Japanese culture.
Yes.
Tell our listeners.
Well, no, I was going to go the other way. My kids are both adopted from Cambodia, and in Cambodia, Mo means stupid, which they really like to point out to me.
Is that right? It's different in Japan, though, right?
What is it now? Wait,
I think it's. I'll look it up here, but I think it's positive in Japan.
Okay, it wasn't so. We still laugh every time we visit Cambodia, and somebody calls my name out, and people turn around like embarrassed.
Is there?
Yeah. But spent the 2 years in Tokyo, then subsequently moved down to Hong Kong for the next 5 after the merger was complete to run Asian operations. Came back to New York with Cantor Fitzgerald at that time. I had been with a competitor up until that point and opened up emerging markets for them. So I was based out of New York.
High finance, are you talking?
Yeah, I ran all emerging market operations, so bonds, stocks, interest rate swaps, capital markets.
International stuff?
All international.
So for foreign municipalities, et cetera?
We did everything. So, but all of the work I was doing at that time was in basically third world countries or emerging markets like a Brazil or an Argentina or Venezuela, China, Russia. We had operations in all those places, South Africa, Poland. So even though I was based in New York, I was never really there a lot.
A lot of time through Kennedy Airport?
A lot of time through Kennedy, unfortunately, for better or worse. And we were expanding. So when I started in 1994, I was the only employee in emerging markets. And then within 2 years, we were the largest emerging market group in the world. So we
when
had
you say
office.
emerging market, Mo, what sorts of opportunities did you see? Tapping into natural resources, infrastructure, providing loans. What were you doing?
It really depends on the country. So a lot of the different countries had, for example, Brazil. Brazil has a vibrant economy at times, and at other times not so vibrant, depending on who's the ruling party. But just like the United States, those countries will issue bonds to finance infrastructure projects to, municipalities. We mostly focused on the international bonds that were being traded at that time out of Brazil, but then we had a partner in Brazil who would handle the domestic side of the business. So you would have like cities issuing bonds in Brazil or municipal governments, and that would be more like our states that would be issuing bonds, which really were not allowed to be traded offshore. So our partner would trade domestically, we would trade internationally. You had equities that would be listed in the New York Stock Exchange from Brazilian companies, but then you would also have the Brazilian Stock Exchange. So that's an example of the kind of things we were involved with.
So you're talking 80s and 90s?
My career lasted mostly through the 80s and 90s, yeah.
And so you were involved in that in the recession of like 88.
88, 94, Russian crisis. That was my probably last major disruption was when Russia defaulted on all their bond payments. We were in the thick of it. And at the same time, we were giving advice to, I was in Vietnam 1 week after we lifted the embargo with Vietnam. We were the first American company to go in and work with their finance ministry and discuss ways that they could start moving forward. I would like to take credit for the advice we gave them, but unfortunately we didn't get too far ahead at that point. But now you look at Vietnam, and it's one of the more vibrant economies. I believe CNN's actually doing a story on it next week, that it's one of the model democracies in the world right now, which is really interesting to see what's happening.
Is that right? I think we need to impose that model maybe on the Philippines. I think that's kind of a troubled country.
We did a lot of work in the Philippines, and it was, the fun part of the whole job was that depending on the week, I was in a different culture. Going to South Korea.
Did you have to leave New York City?
Had to leave New York City.
That was a joke, right?
You don't have to go too far, but it actually helped. It certainly opened up my my mind to a lot of these places. My wife still laughs because when we first started dating, I said I would never leave New York. And then we spent the next 25 years not in New York, basically.
Have you got kids?
I have 2 kids. They're both adopted. They're adopted from Cambodia. So my son was adopted in 2001. We were 1 month after 9/11. We were in Cambodia picking him up.
Oh,
and then,
awesome.
Then my daughter, she's 2 years younger. So we have 2 kids. He currently has the travel bug. He's on his second gap year in 3 years, so we think it's a career choice now, not a true gap year. He just left
Following in his old man's footsteps.
Yeah,
Mongolia,
except I got paid. We're trying to figure out how he's going to do
Mongolia.
it. He was in Mongolia last week. 2 days ago he left, and he's in Thailand today, but really just waiting because he goes up to Bhutan on the 11th, but he had to wait to get his visa to go to Bhutan.
And what's he doing?
Right now he's traveling. He'll go back to Cambodia in September, and he'll work in a school in Cambodia moving forward. It's a one-way ticket at the moment, so we'll see when he decides he either runs out of money or wants to come home.
And your daughter?
My daughter just graduated. She leaves the 28th of this month down to Durango, Colorado. She'll be playing lacrosse at Fort Lewis College, and she'll be a freshman there. So she's actually in California this week, so we've been joking. We're practicing being empty nesters for 1 week.
Awesome.
See how it goes.
Well, my bird just flew in. She's over your shoulder there. That's Morgan Ann. My daughter. Say hi to Mo. Are we up against commercial, Alan?
About 30 seconds.
We got about 30 seconds to go. Morgan Ann, we've got some adoptions in my family. 2 cousins from China. Shout out to Kate and Claire. Back in New York, as well as a cousin from Guatemala. So shout out to nephew. Shout out to Brian. And we can't leave out Emily. But I've spent some time the last few weeks with my family and the kids, and everybody's engaged in summer. We see the world exploding around us before our eyes. And you are the Chief Executive Officer of Voices for Utah Children. And after this commercial break, you're going to tell us what that means.
Sounds good.
Talk with Ted. I'll be right back with Moe Hickey. Welcome back to Talk with Ted. It's 4:44 on Tuesday, August 6, 2019. And I've got Moe Hickey with me, and Mo is with Voices for Utah Children. And if you hear a voice in the background, that's my daughter, Morgan Ann. So she's chewing Mo's ear during the break here and learning about her new principal, right, Mo?
That's right. She has a new principal at Ecker Hill next year, so we're tying the whole Park City School District together here.
And isn't that great? And we are fortunate to be part of the Park City School District because there are wonderful facilities up there. And you served on the board, the school board up there.
I was on the school board for 7 years until I moved. I moved from one house to another, so I moved out of my precinct. So I had to step down. We get elected in precincts up there. So
okay. So we're going to get into a little bit of that. I consider you a little bit of a quasi politician. You had to run for that position.
You did have to run. Interestingly, the first 2 times I ran, I ran unopposed, so I didn't really see the too much of the
Not too
political
much.
side.
That's easy, huh?
And then I got talked into running again the third time, and there was actually 4 people running for the seat, so that was a little different. Didn't win that one, but which turned out being okay.
Okay. Oh, it's funny, huh? Sometimes
Yeah.
you win when you lose.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
So,
And now you're the Chief Executive Officer. Is that the proper title?
yeah, that's the title they use. It's the equivalent of executive director with a lot of other nonprofits.
For Voices for Utah Children, and I'm just going to read a little bit from the mission statement here. Voices for Utah Children works to make Utah a place where all children thrive. We start with one basic question. Is it good for the kids? At Voices for Utah Children, we believe that every child deserves the opportunity to reach his or her full potential. And to achieve this vision, we focus on 5 key areas that benefit the healthy development of all children. This is what you're behind, Mo.
This is it. And we're at a critical time in Utah where I feel we have a unique opportunity as well. 33.6% of our population is under 19 years old, which I look at it and it's, the reason I say we're at a crucial time is there are things we have to fix, there are things we have to get right. If we get them right, the next 20 years could be an amazing time to be in Utah on a number of fronts. At the same time, if, a few missteps and we could have problems for the same period of time.
And the state is facing challenges with integrating the charter school systems into education as well, right? There are a lot of charter schools here.
There are a lot of charter schools here, and I could probably break it down into different subsets of that. And this is more from my time on the school board. Most people still don't realize charter schools are public schools that are just have a different funding mechanism, but it's public taxpayer dollars. So in Utah, you have standalone charter schools, which are formed by parents and funded initially by parents, and then they come into existence after their application's approved. You can have district-sponsored charter schools, which a lot of districts are using that so that they don't have to have capital. They don't use the capital, and they actually get money from a different funding source out of the state. And the reason I say they use it for capital, if you're in a high-growth area and you don't necessarily know if that growth's going to continue, you might not want to be building a lot of long-term buildings. So a charter school can actually be a unique way to fill that void. And then you also have, and we don't have too many of these at the moment, but you have university-sponsored charter schools in Utah. You can have those. Most of them are independent, standalone charter schools. I believe at the moment is still the vast majority. Followed by district-sponsored charters. So if you're familiar with the Learning Center in Park City, that was originally a district charter. Okay. It was the first charter in the state of Utah, I believe. And the reason we did that is because it was the alternative school for the high school at the time, and we needed to have a flexible schedule that allowed for flexible time and seat, things that are in code at that time that were really difficult to work with if you were dealing with students who needed the alternative education.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because I see the charter school system as sort of a opportunity for us to maybe refine, to move away from sort of the one-size-fits-all education.
That was the original promise of charter schools. When they were formed, and I believe it was, I'm going to get my states wrong, it was either Wisconsin or Minnesota had the first charter program. And it really was to do that. It was to be sort of a petri dish of new things in education. Stanford did this great study, and I want to say it's about 4 years old right now. Charter schools that are highly successful either are doing exactly that, looking at new methods, new ideas, new ways of educating, or in low-income, low-performing areas. The average, and the reason I bring that up is because a lot of the middle-of-the-road charters, for lack of a better term, they come into districts that are doing well, that already have a good system in place. They sound great in the beginning because we're going to do different things, but then they fall back into, well, who's going to provide the transportation? Oh, who's going to provide lunches, which charter schools don't necessarily get right away. And then you sort of fall back into the trap of, we'll do things the way we've always done them.
Yeah.
Maybe
the charter schools could integrate with corporate America to design some systems that integrated with the grown-ups' lives as well.
Well, there are some models out there. As a matter of fact, I'll be going to one of the local schools tomorrow to talk about. We started a program up in Park City. It wasn't a charter, but we got the idea from Overland Park, Kansas, and it was the Center for Advanced Professional Studies. So we partner with corporations for back burner projects that they give to the high school students. The teams of high school students get assigned to those projects with a teacher in the classroom, and the teacher originally was not a traditional teacher. It was somebody who may have come out of that field, like engineering or digital technology. And so you had a mentor at the company, you had a mentor who had experience in that field working with the students. So when we started the program, and that's what I'm more familiar with, we built a bomb-sniffing robot for Hill Air Force Base. And it was Rockwell Collins, Hill Air Force Base, the University of Utah, and Park City High School collaborated on the project with a team of students. We did a lot of work with Skull Candy on headsets. They probably gave us, over the years, over 20 projects, 10 of which are actually in the market now.
Oh, very cool.
So, yeah, there are things, and that's what I'd love to see education start looking at more and more, is those changes.
The second segment is always a little bit broken up. When we get to the top of the hour, we'll fold all of this in again. But back to Voices for Utah Children. Is it fair to say that a backdrop for some of the main backdrop for some of the fundamental problems that that organization deals with is arises from a disparity of economic resources or opportunity?
Yeah, quite a bit of the issues we focus on fall back into that area. What's interesting about Utah is, although we're heading towards a larger minority population, we're right now at about 18%, depending on the last numbers. We'll be getting actually updated numbers next month that we'll be publishing. But take one example. So we have 71,000 children in Utah that do not have insurance at the moment. Any form of insurance for a lot of different reasons. 45,000 of those children are in rural, predominantly Caucasian communities. So it's more of a socioeconomic issue than it is a race issue, which a lot of people default to. Yeah. So part of our mission is to educate people that these are issues affecting all children. It's not one specific group. If we could it would be great if we could wave a magic wand and say it's just one group. Yeah. But it's not. Issues facing us in early childhood are across the board. It's what's really interesting, and I'm learning this. It's been a grand total of 8 weeks on the job, some of which I had background knowledge with, but a lot of the issues that face our minority populations on the Wasatch Front are the exact same issues that are facing our rural populations. So
how so? Tie that up for me.
Well, I'll give you an example. Early child care. Here's my I say favorite statistic, but it's a horrible statistic. For licensed child care 0 to 2 years old in Utah right now, 1 year cost is more than 1 year average college tuition in Utah.
Really?
Yeah. It costs about $9,000 for 1 year of high quality 0 to 2 child care.
Now, I want to point out something that I saw in the paper a week or two ago. I thought I saw a high school maybe up in Ogden that was providing some daycare services for students that had girls that had gotten pregnant and had a child. Is that rumor or does that exist?
No, that exists, and that exists in more than one school. That's the one that was highlighted. I saw that article as well. Yeah. That's taking place all around the country and in different parts of Utah.
And we see, too, now where there's mental health services being offered to young people in schools.
There are, but, and I have a sort of more knowledge than I care on this issue. My wife is a forensic psychiatrist at the state hospital, so I get all the data from the state hospital.
Tough job.
Part of our problem here is that we don't have enough trained staff throughout the state. So even the counselors that we're trying to put into schools are not necessarily crisis counselors that are trained to deal with these issues.
You know how you get more of them? You pay them.
You pay them. Well, The second hour we could talk about pay across the board. Going back to the early childhood, a preschool teacher, the average preschool teacher in the United States, and Utah falls right into this, is paid below poverty level. So here we are taking.
And I think the same could be true with first responders, ambulance, firefighters.
When you factor in all the
fighting for
costs,
benefits.
there's a great, we've just gotten this, but it's a living wage calculator that MIT put out. So a lot of times people will look at it and just say, oh, well, the federal poverty rate's $29,000, $29,800, I think, for a family of four. Well, what's really important is where do you live and what does that number mean? So, for example, I just looked at Summit County. Because I lived there, and it just was something I was interested in. So for a single mother in Summit County with one child, not in Park City, but Summit County, you would have to make $25.70 an hour. That would have to be your hourly wage to break even for the year.
So let me give you a little story here with that setup. I can remember years ago, I was in court down in Price, Utah, down near Helper, and it was a debt collection court. And it was one of the saddest court experiences I'd ever seen, where one poor person after another, oftentimes women with a baby in their arms, explaining how they couldn't meet a $5 or $10 a month obligation and being burdened with further costs, et cetera. And it always struck me that burden there. Well, I was recently in court up in Park City, and I saw two things where there were two women successively, I'll say, who had committed minor infractions, I think speeding tickets. And they both got up and indicated that they were homeless, living in a shelter, trying or on the verge of procuring work. Both of them had an amazing spirit, but it struck me that here it is. It felt like Price, Utah 15 years ago, and we have it right here in Park City. And what they got was sort of an extension of a plea in abeyance, both of them, so they didn't get in a lot of trouble or sent to jail for not paying those fines yet. But then they were both sentenced to community service as a way of paying those fines, and they were credited for community service at a nonprofit at $10 an hour. And I'm sitting in the back going, didn't you hear? They're in homeless shelters. They're the ones that need our help, and we're giving them an opportunity to work it off at $10 an hour at your local charity when you're saying, Mo, that you need to make $25.70 an hour to get by up there.
To get by up there, and that's Summit County. I would argue Park City would be closer to $30 an hour because we're taking Colville and other places into consideration with the $25.77.
Yeah, but I point that out. I think there's real fundamental problems with our legal system, and that there needs to be reform to get people out of that trap. And if you're living in a homeless shelter and you've got a job lined up, maybe we give them a break on their fine for a small infraction.
Well, and this is more in your ballywick, as they say, but they did just come out with a report that Utah spends the most money on minor infractions as far as expenses in the justice system than any state per capita in the country. We spend an additional $75 million on minor infractions on things like that, where
put the money somewhere else.
Person can't afford bail, we put him in prison. Person misses a meeting, we put him into the county jail.
Right now, we're missing a commercial break.
Okay.
We're at the top of the hour. We'll be right back with Moe Hickey, Talk with Ted.
I switched up the commercials, so it's a little bit
There we go. There.
So.
Welcome back, Salt Lake City. Sorry, back on. I got the headphones on. I thought we had a couple more minutes. 5:05. It just turned on August 6, 2019. My name's Ted McBride. You might be just getting out of work. We're live on 1640 K-Talk, live streaming on Facebook, K-Talk Media, here in the heart of the Salt Lake Valley in Murray, Utah. And I've got with me a former New Yorker. I'm feeling at home, Moe Hickey. Moe is the Chief Executive Officer of Voices for Utah Children, and we kind of briefly touched on your background and talking about problems that exist in this world and the identification of some solutions, especially for young people out there. And we, I opened up talking about these shootings and the problems that we have in this country, and I think we really need world support to address those problems. I think at the heart of it is opportunity for young people, and when they see the skyrocketing housing crisis, their distrust of financial systems, and it's a scary world, and I think that too much of it, they gaining justification from what they hear, rhetoric, both sides echoing at a deafening sound, and that we need to figure out a way to address the root of the problem rather than just point at the product of it and say, there it is again.
No, I would agree with that. During the break, I was saying to Alan, Utah does it just like everybody else in this country. We don't go backwards and look at how we got here, and we don't look forward and say, how can we improve these? We're sort of stuck where we are today. You can always learn from the kids. So my son had come home from his last trip, and he said, there's an Asian expression, but there's also the same Native American expression, which is don't pull the dead fish out of the water, go back upstream and find out why they died. And it's something that stuck with me from that point, whether it's been in my work in education or with Voices now. A lot of these problems didn't just happen overnight.
Yeah, we inherited economic systems, and the Russians inherited their systems, and I think that it's really got to be some sort of compromise between the systems for what's in our best interest.
Yeah, and when as you were mentioning, especially with the youth, one of the things that I'm adamant about is, we've gone through a new revolution. We've had the Industrial Revolution, and if we went back and looked at that, the lives of children changed because of the Industrial Revolution, right? Well, we've gone through the technological revolution, and we're actually probably only about 30 or 40% through it. What's coming in the next few years is going to be mind-boggling, I think, like when you look at virtual reality and augmented reality and some of the things that's going to be coming with artificial intelligence.
Neuralink, are you familiar with Neuralink?
Yes, it's going to be amazing. But
we're trying to get Elon Musk to come on the show here. So
good luck with that. Yeah, I'll set the stage for him.
I was hoping to get Morgan to do that pitch for me. He couldn't say no to her.
But I truly believe that institutionally, we haven't taken a step back and looked at that. And, we were talking briefly about schools. Like, how do you change schools knowing that we have different students today or different desires or different time frames? I joke with my friends, and dating myself, I'm older than most students, but we've become an on-demand generation, right? Good friend of mine's an announcer for the Brooklyn Nets. And he told me an amazing statistic, right? 95% of NBA fans watch the NBA on a handheld device.
Wow.
95%.
95%.
Watch it on a handheld device. Go to an airport when there's a basketball game on, a football game on. It's the adults sitting there watching, looking at their phones, right? I watch network TV rarely. Right? It's Hulu, it's Amazon, no plugs, right? But all of those services. So as adults, we're doing it, and we've sort of been on the tail end of it, and yet we don't look at our children and say, wait a second, why aren't we changing the educational system to address that? It used to be, the former president of Westminster here had a great line. He said, teachers used to be the sage on the stage, and now they're the guide on the side. The information is readily available now. We used to have to go to the library, find the book, go through it, look for the information. Now the information is at the fingertips, which creates a great opportunity. It's how do we teach critical thinking? How do we let students explore?
And I think that with what you're saying, too, it's got me thinking about how it's going to be changing even more in ways that we can't even comprehend. That we've got to be open to modifications to our education system to adjust to that technological development. Am I right here? My mic sounds a little fine.
Yeah, how do you engage students when, use the on-demand example I gave before. So you tell a student that okay, well, in 3 weeks we're going to do this based on what we're talking about today, and they're number one, they're used to doing everything immediately now, or at least except when the parent asks them to do it, right? Everything else is immediate.
Right.
But we have to start changing that. The other thing that was really brought to my attention when I was on the school board was we've allowed our children to be online 16 hours a day, for better or worse, right? And a lot of schools still to this day, when they bring them in, we go back to an old-fashioned way of teaching. So we're, and I'm not saying we have to blow up the system completely, but there are things being done. We talked about it in the last hour at charter schools, at forward-thinking schools. So I'll give you an example. You have the blended classroom where you can bring different technology into the classroom. You can also, and I've seen this happen with my kids, where, and I'm forgetting the term for it, but instead of doing the homework at home, which a lot of students don't have a parent who can even help with the homework, that you would actually do the homework in the classroom, but you would actually be sent home to do the research. So in math, you'd be like, okay, let's learn about triangles. So you go home and read about it. If you understand it, that's great. You can move forward in the class. But
and even the kids that have capable and responsible parents, those parents, myself, it's hard to get to all of those needs every day.
Absolutely. It's called the flipped classroom. That finally came to me as we were talking. But it's that mentality of meet the children where they are, right? So they prefer to do the research. So let them do the research, and actually then have some peer groups that can help them with the problems when they come into the classroom. And the teacher can then identify and walk the classroom and be that sage, right? Helping. No, you're just looking at it differently. Move forward this way. And I've seen it work. And
yeah, and there can be amazing results in the system. I have friends that have children with autism that have struggled to get proper accommodations in certain places. And in my family, shout out to my sister Suzanne. But in the family, sometimes the kids need some extra help.
sure.
And I've got in my family a nephew of mine from Guatemala who needed that help, and he's made remarkable progress. Again, shout out to Brian, achieving even honors designations in math and reading. And a few years ago, if you had seen him and where he was at, you would have doubted whether he could make it where he did today. So it's amazing what persistent education can do.
Absolutely. It's the number one thing. The one thing consistently through our history as a country is once public education became embedded in the country, we saw the improvements.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, the public education, because it wasn't that long ago when we didn't have public education. And here in Utah, one of the first public schools is right in Mill Creek. If you stumble around Mill Creek, there's a lot of history in Mill Creek. And there's a historical marker there celebrating the first school in Utah. I think it was in the 1880s, I think. But they finally got away from the rich people being able to afford to send their kids to school, no different than, in Africa and places around the world today, to the system of free education for everyone. But that first free education in Utah was right at an old schoolhouse in Mill Creek.
And, if you look back on it, and I appreciate that history because that's what really changed the country. That's what turbocharged our economy at the turn of the century and continued to do so. We still have...
Think about how the economic opportunity must have been so separated then. If only the people that had the money that could afford to educate their kids, it would certainly perpetuate a dominant class of people with money.
Oh, absolutely. And, on a side note, this is something that we talked about a lot in Park City at one point was sports and how it worked in the public education system. So if you go back to the turn of the century, a lot of people seem to relate to the sports more than the actual education part. But you had the New York Athletic Club, you had the Los Angeles Athletic Club, the Downtown Club in Chicago, et cetera. So sports in the early 1900s were only for rich kids at those clubs. That was it. Public schools didn't have sports. So
That's why basketball was sort of revolutionary, because it provided an opportunity for inner city kids to play that game without the field.
Exactly. And so what happened was it became an equality issue. So schools started having sports so that all kids could participate. Problem now is we've come almost full circle, and because of cuts in educational funding, et cetera, the price to pay for a lot of families now to participate in a sport is astronomical.
Well, then you'll also see school districts go crazy supporting, raising money to build a stadium.
Texas.
For their football team,
Yes.
rather than investing it back into the resources that are needed.
Absolutely. We used to, it was a sad joke, but, if you fired a teacher, you got about 5 emails back when I was on the school board. If you fired a coach, you got about 250 emails immediately. Right? And we were a small district, but, you go to a place like Texas or Florida, they live and breathe football. That person has a higher ranking in the community than the average teacher, which...
Yeah, and it's even part of the sociological way out for the black kid, to attach themselves to that fame and fortune. They seek that as a way out. There's got to be other ways along the way for the people that don't make it to stardom.
Now, I'll tell you a quick funny story. So when I was a junior in high school, going into my senior year, I was a basketball player. And I went to a camp.
How tall are you, Mo?
I'm 6'3".
6'3".
So that's important. So I'm 6'3", and I go to 5-star basketball camp.
No, you're kidding me. You went to 5-star?
I went to 5-star.
Have you heard any of my shows? I'm talking about 5-star all the time.
Oh,
Did
really?
you go to
No.
Homesdale?
Yeah, Homesdale.
What year?
Homesdale. I was there in 75.
I was there in 83, 84, 85.
Okay, so you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Sure.
And so we had the first Monday, we had Lefty Drizel come in and give the lunchtime talk from Maryland. He was in Maryland. Then we had Dean Smith, then we had Mike Krzyzewski. But the fourth person, and they all came in and gave the 45-minute, Duke, and
Krzyzewski was probably at West Point at that time.
He was just starting at Duke, and he had just had his first winning record, so they brought him in, and he was, right on the cusp. He had Jaminski, and those guys had just come in. They were the classes before me. But Al McGuire just won the national championship with Marquette. And I'm sitting between Kim Belton, 6'9", future center at Stanford, Corny Thompson, 6'10", future center at Connecticut. And McGuire walks in, picks up the mic, gets off a motorcycle, picks up the mic, and goes, "Yeah, 2 of you have a chance of playing professionally. I suggest you go to class." Puts the mic down, gets on his motorcycle, and leaves.
That was it.
I look at the 2 guys next to me, and I'm like, "Well, I'm not one of the 2 guys," and neither were they, by the way, right?
I knew I wasn't.
Yeah. So, it's become, I think people need to hear that at times. I think, kids need to hear that. Great. A sport is great. A sport can do a lot for you. I'm living through that with my daughter right now. She's having an opportunity to play a sport in college. But I keep telling her that's the fun aspect, right? The degree is the end result here. And unfortunately, we're not doing that enough with a lot of those students when they, we're churning out athletes in major colleges and they're not getting degrees.
Did you play college basketball?
I actually went to Wagner to play, and my first coach was P.J. Carlissimo.
Oh, really? So you were better than me.
Well, I dislocated my knee on the first day.
Really?
And I wound up playing rugby for the next 25 years.
And P.J. Carlissimo, of course, notorious or famous for being choked by Latrell Sprewell.
Yes, he was.
15, 20 years ago. And funny, so I had a friend of mine, Bill Bano, is an assistant coach at the Indiana Pacers.
Okay.
And I had him on this show just a couple of months ago, and we were talking 5-star basketball camp and the role that it played in his life. And I cherished my time back at 5-star getting my brains beat out by guys like you, because you were taller and bigger and better than me.
But wasn't it great?
Yeah,
I mean,
great.
It was the most miserable great week of your life.
I still remember I had
the other way to describe it.
I had one great play, and the college coaches could come and watch us. And Digger Phelps from Notre Dame yelled at me, "What's your name, boy?" McBride, I yelled at him. But a great moment in my youth, and I learned great lessons from basketball.
Oh, it was like when I say it was miserable, because all you did was get up first thing in the morning until you went to bed at night. You were just playing and playing and playing against amazing competition.
Yeah, you had to be invited to go to the camp.
Right. Yeah.
So you had to be halfway decent.
Yeah, wasn't.
Yeah, I got it handed to me. Gotta tell you,
we got there, one way or another.
Yeah. You learn how to lose, though, right?
Oh, you do. You do. And that's, that's an important thing.
And
Good lesson.
my friend Bill Bano there, he is connected with PJ Carlissimo, so it's funny that you say that. PJ gave him one of his early breaks out of five-star basketball camp.
Okay.
With Seton Hall.
Seton Hall.
Yep.
I was going to say Bill's name sounded familiar. So, PJ went to Seton Hall after Wagner and then went to Portland.
I met the famous coach Lou Carnesecca when I was in high school. I had a family in-law bring me down. That was when Chris Mullen was playing, and Lou said he was going to come take a look at me, but I never did see him in the stands.
He didn't go too far from St. John's at the time.
The great coach from St. John's.
He was great.
Yeah.
My high school basketball coach was his cousin.
Oh, cool.
So we got to go out to the St. John's games.
And I've got family friends. Shout out to Father Joe and Sister Ann, but he worked at St. John's and is friends with Coach Carnesecca. So into another commercial break. We kind of drifted off point a little bit there, but when we come back, we're going to get back on point about Voices for Utah Children. Talk with Ted. We'll be right back. Sound doesn't sound right. There it is. Welcome back to Talk with Ted. It's 5:24 on Tuesday, August 6th, 2019. Beautiful summer day. Looks a little overcast, some clouds coming in. It's been dry out there. High fire danger. Go easy on the fireworks. It's that time of year. There's fires breaking out all over the place. We live in the desert, don't we, Mo?
Yes, we do. And it's, I was just commenting the other day how Park City this is the greenest I've seen it this late in a few years. But
how long
still,
have you been here? When did you move to Park City?
I moved here full-time 16 years ago this week.
Okay.
So,
2003?
2003, we moved here and bought my first place in Park City in 1988.
And what attracted you to Park City?
That's a funny story. So
it's a silly question, rhetorical question.
Well, actually,
right?
it wasn't for me in the beginning. So I was based in Los Angeles working at the time and had a client from Japan. And the people that aren't familiar, Japanese traders, bank traders at that time used to spend 5 years and then they'd be transferred, cycled back to Japan. He was one of my best clients. We used to but he was a guy you couldn't do anything for. Like, you want to go out to dinner? No. But he would want to come over and hang out in the backyard over the weekends. Just a nice guy and very humble. So he was getting transferred back. And I called him up and I said, I heard you, now that you're being transferred, I don't care what it is. We got to do something for a weekend. And he goes, oh, I've heard about this place, Park City. I wouldn't mind going skiing. So as we talked about in the last segment, I had played basketball, so I'd never skied in my life. I had one day at Hunter Mountain.
I had to choose when I was 13 years old.
Okay.
What'll it be, skiing or basketball?
Yeah, and so I never skied at that point. So I said, sure, we'll go to this place, Park City, and we'll go skiing. Called up another Japanese client who was a friend, and I said, you're coming with me. He wants to go skiing. And he just starts laughing hysterically, and I'm like, what? And he goes, oh, he was on 2 Japanese Olympic teams. And he'd never told anybody. He just was that kind of guy.
Really?
And I'm like, oh, we're in so much trouble, we're coming. So I got a guy from New York office who knew how to ski and said, you're coming out to meet us. So we go up there and
up where? To Park City?
Park City, and we're falling all over the mountain. Didn't know what we were doing, except for those 2. And one of the guys that worked for me who was with us decided it'd be funny to put my name on a realtor's list. And we went back on Sunday night. Monday morning, I flew to Tokyo for a 2-week business trip. I came home. My wife's like, why is this person calling us? We're not buying a place. And she grew up skiing in New Hampshire.
Okay.
So I said, well, you never know. And we're not going to buy a place, but you'd like it. We should go back up and visit. So make a long story short, we went up that fall. The realtor showed us around town. At that time in 1988, if you paid back taxes on Main Street, you owned the building. Oh. In Park City.
In what year?
1988. 87, 88 was, we were coming out of another financial crisis. Yeah. And Park City had their own crisis. Deer Valley was just opening.
It was a ghost town, basically.
So basically,
right? Coming out of a depression.
She showed us a townhouse that they were giving away. And we were like, and I heard my wife go, yeah, we're interested. And I'm like, what just happened here? So make a long story short, we bought the house, and 3 months later, I got transferred to Tokyo, and never lived in Los Angeles again, and had a place in Park City. So we held on to it, and when we adopted our kids, and they were getting ready for school age, we decided it would be, let's give it a shot. The school system was great. You know, I was getting ready to retire. My wife was ready to start a medical practice. And
How old? I'm sorry.
How old?
Go ahead. You finish your thought.
So, no, and we just said, let's give it a shot, and we have a place, so it's not like we're, you know, moving into a place that we don't have a place to live, et cetera. And that's when we came out, and the rest is...
How old were the kids then?
My son was going into first grade, and my daughter, so he was 6. He did kindergarten in Atlanta. My wife did a fellowship at Emory University, but we did, he came for first grade at McPullen Elementary, and my daughter came out and started kindergarten a year later at McPullen.
So true Parkites.
True Parkites. They went
system.
right through the system.
Because, you know, the first question you ask anyone from Park City is, where are you from?
Absolutely.
Because it ain't Park City most of the time, at least my generation.
Not at all. And, you know, I could say most of my friends are not from, you know, very few people were born and raised in Park City that had kids at that age. You know, my son's the wise one in the family, and he's like, so you took a kid from the equator in Cambodia and put him in a mountain in Utah.
And how did you do?
He's a ridiculously so much better skier than I am, and he's a big dirt jump biker, and he embraced the lifestyle.
Did they face any issues growing up, being Cambodian here in Utah?
They did. I wouldn't say it was. They faced more in the past year.
And you know what I mean by that question.
Yes.
Sort of the big negative loaded question.
Absolutely. More in the past year. My son was directly confronting it when he was here.
Really?
Last
How
year
so?
or so. Oh, people just came up to him, and, you know, the get out, go back to where you belong comment was made.
Really?
Yeah.
This day and age, that's hard to believe.
Absolutely. He actually, you know, he had some minor issues in school because being dark-skinned, he would be lumped with the Latino students in some teachers' minds. That happened once and only once. You know, we talked about it, and it didn't happen again. But, you know, the only, and I wouldn't say it's a regret, because they both have loved living there, and they're both loving moving out now for the time being. But, you know, we really didn't have the diversity that probably I would have liked to have had them see.
Yeah.
You know, when I was on school board, at one point I was joking, you know, we'd have, you know, Caucasian students, Latino students, Asian students, and I would stop the meeting and go, so you posted my 2 kids' grades up in the Asian column? Because that was it. We didn't have a lot of Asian students at the time. Right? Yeah, I mean, we had more than that. We probably had 10 Asian students in the whole district at that time.
Interesting.
Which has changed. We've had a large influx come from the Philippines, which has been good.
Yeah.
You know,
I see a lot of Filipino people up in Park City.
Absolutely, it's part of the resort, you know, industry, and they're good. They're good. They're good members of the community. And I loved my kids went to McPullen, as I said, and it's the only really diverse school in the Park City School District at the elementary level, and I loved it.
And it's interesting that you referenced the more immediate incident where your son's an adult. Being discriminated against.
Yeah.
You know, we worry about when they're kids, but here you speak even as an adult.
Yeah, and, you know, it's a challenge we're going to face in Utah. You know, I had a great conversation when I was on years ago with a legislator, and, you know, a lot of parts of Utah have never really changed. And I'm not saying that in a disparaging way. It's
what's interesting, too, is that there's many, many people in Utah that have seen other parts of the world, too, you know, with the missionary program.
Right.
There are people here that have seen the depths of despair in the far reaches of the world, for sure.
Yeah, so, you know, and I said earlier that I feel there's opportunities here, and part of that is that opportunity, right? People have seen other parts of the world, and hopefully they're coming back with different views, right?
Speaking of coming back, Governor Huntsman is coming back and maybe running again. Did you see that?
You know, I guess his wife outed him on an interview, so he had to make it official.
Is that
today.
what happened?
That's what I heard. I heard that she was on some interview, and she slipped and said, when we come back in the fall. Yeah. And so he officially went on and made it official. He handed in his resignation today, I guess. Yeah. So he'll be coming back. And
culturally, too, you know, that speaking of adoption, you know, in your experiences, and, you know, there's a lot of that in Utah culture as well.
Yeah. Governor Huntsman has an adopted daughter from China.
Yeah.
So
And even adoptions from the Native American community,
yes,
from the African American community.
yes. We have, the refugee community, and you see it more in Salt Lake. Refugee, not just adoption, but also just outright the refugee community here. I think it's Rose Park Elementary School. At one point, they had 100 languages being spoken in that one school from the families.
Yeah, and again, that's culturally, that historically our state has been open to receiving refugees from around the world. There's a lot of people from the former Yugoslavia here.
Right.
Right.
Oh, yeah. No, we have, when you really start breaking it down and looking at it, we have a very diverse pockets in Utah. And, we were just talking about this in the office recently. So, refugees are in a good position in Utah. Legal immigrants are in an okay position in Utah. Now we have an illegal immigrant population, or undocumented, right? Whichever word you want to use. And I looked at that number today, and we have about 100,000 undocumented immigrants in Utah at last count, roughly 100,000. The problem is this, and the issues that I'm working on with children is, how do you differentiate a child in a classroom being a refugee, being illegal, or undocumented? You don't. As a teacher, you don't. So how do we change our mindset that it's children? And the best outcome is to provide the service for all the children equally so that we get the best outcome, right? Because I don't know one teacher that can stand in a classroom and can look at a kid and say what they are.
Or for that teacher to have some universal answer for all those kids.
Absolutely. And I don't think we're going to be a Texas or maybe even in Arizona where we're going to be majority minority in the next 10, 15 years. I don't think Utah will get to that level, but we're certainly going to be going into the 25 to 30% minority range in the state if all projections hold. So we are going to have to train teachers differently.
What is it now?
We're at about 17%.
It's interesting because the African American population is about 3%.
Right.
And so, compared to other places in the country, we look, I think, whiter than we are here in Utah.
Yeah, when you break all the groups out and include Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, we're probably at about 75% Caucasian still in the state, and 25% is made up of other groups. But the challenges that it's an interesting state to look at, and the more you look at the data, the more interesting it gets to me. And I'm a data geek, so that part is fun. But you look at it, and I said earlier, the issues that you're facing here on the Wasatch Front with low-income minority groups is the same issues that you're facing in Paiute with rural Caucasian groups. They're mostly related to socioeconomics. So we have areas of the state of Utah where it's hard to get access health care. So accessing is a problem. But we also have the problem that we have uninsured in those areas as well as in our minority populations. So the good news for me is
when you talk about rural too, is it safe to assume that those are less diverse areas?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I can give you an exact number. Out of the 71,000 kids that don't have insurance, slightly over 45,000 are rural Caucasian students, children, right? So instead of segregating our beliefs, we have to look at it and say, how do we do the best for all those children? So I'll give you an example. We have we just passed the Medicare expansion, and now we look at it for children. Well, in Utah, it's $12,900 for a single mother with one child. The child qualifies. If that mother works overtime next month, because of the Utah system, the child loses their insurance for that month if her average goes above the $12,900.
That makes sense.
Instead of saying, let's sign the child up and they're good for 1 year so we can have a continuum of health care, and after 1 year we go back. So I just talked to a young lady who used to work for me in another organization, and her mother had to go through this every month where she actually had to consider whether she should take overtime to benefit her family or not take the overtime because her daughter would lose the insurance. And you mentioned something earlier, when you're talking about buying a quart of milk when we're down to those levels, which a lot of these families are,
Yeah.
and yet we're rolling the dice on insurance and on health care. The problem is now it goes into the schools, right? If the child's not getting adequate health care, then we have truancy, absenteeism, acting out in school. So we pay that price. So what we have to come up with is we have to come up with everybody coming to an agreement that investing, the two biggest investments we can make as a general society, but Utah in particular, if we could have health insurance for every child 0 to 18, guaranteed health insurance, and if we could have guaranteed high-quality preschool for every child, the benefits that the state would reap in the next decades would be astounding. Because the research has proven those are the two major things you can do.
And as you're talking, and we're talking about the kids and the Voices for Utah Children, all I can hear echoing throughout your sentiment there is it's really a family program. You talk about the voice of the child, but it's really kind of healing top to bottom, isn't it?
It really is. And we're, one of the things that it's always hard for a nonprofit because you want to fix everything, right? I mean, and I fall into that trap a lot.
We need the profits to start fixing everything.
Well, but like even this week when, we had the unfortunate mass shootings, right? The first thing is, what can we do about guns, right? Now, interestingly, the American Association of Pediatrics does take positions on gun violence and on racism in communities. We have to partner with people like that and say that's not our core focus. We want to support you. We want to be on that list.
Not to politicize it, is that the idea?
But just let them have their focus on that because that's where their strong point is, right? We're limited. We're 7 full-time staff, so we look at it and say, okay, where can we make the most impact on the children of Utah directly? Because that's where our focus is. There are 41 other groups like ours in different states that are focusing on their individual state. So that's also a great thing because we have a depth of resources that I didn't know we had when I joined the organization. I mean, I have more data than I'll be able to use moving forward.
And are there other similar organizations in Utah that do what you're doing?
Not as directly as what we do. There are a host of groups and nonprofits that are focusing on different issues that affect children. There are groups that are focusing on early childhood. There are groups that are focusing on child care. There are groups that are focusing on health care.
And is yours sort of tying it all together?
That's one of our roles. And the nice part, we will never implement a program, meaning we're not coming into any community and saying, we're here to run your child care program or your preschool program. What we are is a resource that we want to partner with those groups and say, we have the data to support why you should be doing this. So when your local politicians need to know, we will provide that.
So who are you sharing that information with?
We will share that with
community leaders, church leaders, educators?
All of the above. And anybody else that wants to work with us. I met with a group of concerned parents this week who they want to know why it's important that if their kids are going to Montessori, why I think it's so important that their school district should have pre-K for the other children. And I'm like, okay, when you get to kindergarten and you want to put your child back into the public school system, if the other children you're talking about who didn't have the resources to go to Montessori or a private program are now in that classroom in kindergarten with your child, by definition, that kindergarten class is going to fall behind because we're playing catch up with the other students. But if we can bring
those dominoes falling the other way.
They do. But if we can bring everybody in at grade level, that class will accelerate.
Fascinating. We're up against the last commercial break. We'll be right back with the last segment with Moe Hickey, Voices for Utah Children, and it's been a great voice so far. So stay around. We'll be right back with the last segment. With the number 40. And I've got with me Moe Hickey from Voices of Utah Children. And in case you missed earlier, Moe had a career in finance, 20 years in the financial industry, moving into the education realm, or serving on a school board up in Park City, now currently serving as executive director of Voices for Utah Children. And I just got to grill you here a little bit, Mo, because you're talking a lot of Japanese. I think your manager at Cantor Fitzgerald knew what they were doing when they assigned you to the Japanese circuit, because your name in Japanese means Japanese that refers to feelings of strong affection, mainly towards characters. So it's no surprise, I think, that you garnered the trust of the Japanese people. They could identify with you.
It was a great experience. That part was a lot of fun.
You were talking about a couple important things in education here in Utah, in particular, access for all to preschool.
Yeah, high quality preschool. It was interesting. So when I really became immersed in this was going back when I was on the Park City School Board, and we were looking at what's the most important thing we could do in terms of educational investment. And at that time, I think it was around 2010 or 11, the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, of all people, had been commissioned a study to see the financial benefits of high quality preschool programs in the United States. And
there's a lot of private preschools and great competition for that market.
Absolutely. So they did a universal study, and they included private and public, but high quality was the key defining point. And what they found was that you had a 14-time return on every dollar invested in high-quality preschool over the life of that child.
And we think it doesn't start historically until kindergarten, right?
Exactly. And the problem with that is, and this is how I first actually got involved with Voices as well. So Voices at the time had all this data that I needed to bring to the community in Park City to show why we should have high-quality preschool put into Park City across the board.
Into the public school system.
Into the public school system. So one of the things was, if you come from a nurturing family where you have high parental involvement and you have access to a high-quality preschool program, by third grade you would have over 2 million words read to you at that point in your life. If you came from a broken family or a family where everybody was working, 16-hour days, and you didn't have high quality preschool, you had 30,000 words read to you by third grade.
That make a difference.
That's the difference. And Voices at that time, and I'm looking for it right now, there was an MRI scan of a brain done of the two children. And that was the turning point for me. One was full, one had gaps. The brain actually had gaps in the synapses.
I've got to share a personal experience that goes back even before that. She's sitting right there. She's not on the mic today. But one thing that we did with Morgan then that was very helpful before she could even speak was sign language.
Yeah.
And we used signing time, some videos that she was able to sit in front of and tell us when if she wanted more of anything or less, but to be able to even communicate before being able to speak.
Absolutely, and that goes back to that parental involvement.
Just communicate a different way.
Different ways, yeah. And when people say, because one of the things that I'll hear is, well, when I was growing up, we didn't need those preschool programs. Well, again, this goes back to society's different in a lot of ways. Right
Look
now,
at all
right?
of us.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
We turned out great, but you had a. For the most part, going back, and I grew up, my elementary years were in the early 60s. You had a parent at home, or you had two parents.
Did you go to public school?
I actually didn't, ironically, because I went to a Catholic school in New York.
Yeah,
I was raised Catholic.
I went to Catholic parochial in high school.
But back then, people look at it differently now, too. Back then it was very minimal cost to go to a Catholic school.
Well, and now those are not even an option in places. They're being closed, consolidated, sisters not teaching at the schools.
Right. Absolutely.
A whole host of issues.
And my brother actually went to a public high school, and I went to a Catholic high school at the same time in New York. But the support units that were there at the time, and people didn't move, and people didn't migrate to different places. So there was a lot of things have changed.
Yeah, the old neighborhood.
Exactly. Right? So you
With
don't
the old
have
families,
and you'd have a parent reading to 4 kids, or you had public libraries all around New York City that you could pop into and get books and all of those things. So we can argue that things have changed, and they should be the way they were, but they're not going to be back to that. So we know what high-quality preschool can do. So why fight something that we know works?
And you were talking some statistics right before we went off the air about the program in Park City.
Yeah, we've seen the program in Park City close the achievement gap amongst all the students.
And again, the program being the integration of this preschool?
The preschool program. So we have a 3-year-old program and a 4-year-old program in Park City leading into kindergarten.
3-year, 4-year-old, 3 and 4-year-olds?
Yes.
Okay. And
Yeah.
how long have those been in place?
That program's been in place about 7 years now. And interestingly, we have a wider achievement gap in the older grades that didn't have the preschool program. And we're seeing that achievement gap narrow with the kids that had the preschool program
So
opportunity.
you've got some measurable results already?
We do, but the best measurables, interestingly, is Granite School District. Granite School District was
down here in the valley?
the first school district in Utah to put in a high-quality preschool program, and they have seen the benefits from it. And if you look at Granite School District, it's one of the better-performing school districts across the board in Utah over the past 10 years. And a lot of that can be attributed to their preschool program. They decided that they were going to do it. They decided they were going to fund it. And the origins of that too were Goldman Sachs was actually involved in the funding of the original programs here on the Wasatch Front.
Really?
Yeah.
How did that come about?
They issued a success bond, and they said if Granite School District met the requirements of what they proposed that they were going to be able to do, Goldman Sachs would fund the program.
Good for
And-
Goldman
and
Sachs.
Goldman
They've got a
Sachs
big
would
presence here in Salt Lake
And
City.
and if Granite didn't meet what they were required to do, the money would have to have been paid back at that point.
Really?
And they wound up meeting all the goals they set.
When did they do that?
That was back around the same time. I
10
want to say
years?
it's a little over 10 years ago.
Anybody else doing that? Like that?
They've done it in different parts of the country, but nobody else has done it here after that. And I think a lot of it is that the fear factor of what if I have to pay it back? What if we're not successful? Instead of saying we're going to be successful.
That the districts are reluctant to borrow it or to get money under those terms?
Well, there's two things. Districts, preschool doesn't fall under the K-12 budget, so the money would have to be raised outside of that. So, for example, in Park City, the preschool program is run through the Park City Ed Foundation, so it's privately raised money in Park City to fund that program. It doesn't come out of the K-12 budget because it's not allowable by state law.
And then this may be a stupid question, but is that money used for folks that otherwise can't afford those daycare services?
It's open to anybody.
It's open to anybody.
It's open to anybody.
It's just to
help to fund the program and have the teachers in the classroom.
How come I had no idea that such a thing existed? It doesn't get a lot of press.
It doesn't. It did when it first started, and in Park City, it doesn't get the publicity now because it's kind of a given that it's there. And now, I just met with the Ed Foundation executive director 2 days ago, and I said, one of the things you have to do is start addressing the salary of the preschool teachers, because as I mentioned earlier, preschool teachers in Park City as well as across the country are paid below the poverty level.
And you're telling us that it's that critical for future development that we start at that year earlier than what we're accustomed to.
It is like I said, all the research proves, and there was a report that came out last week, and I'm trying to remember what the name of the group that did the report. It wasn't Carnegie, but somebody of that level. And this is universal. Health insurance and early childhood education. If we funded those two things, whether it's here in Utah or across the country, the return on that investment, there's nothing else we could do that would match it.
And when you say health insurance, you're talking for the children.
For the children. There are little things. I learned this years ago. Again, you can learn so much going to different places in Utah. So Rose Park Elementary, I mentioned them earlier. They have a community center.
Tony Finau country, right? Are you a golfer?
Yes.
Tony's from Rose Park.
It has a community center attached to the school. They have a dentist that comes in once a week, I think, at that time. The reason being, in elementary school, one of the number one causes of absence from elementary school is dental-related issues that are not identified as such.
Dental?
Especially with low-income students who don't have access to dental care. It manifests itself as an earache or a stomach ache, but it's an abscess.
Sometimes there's underlying mental issues, too, that can contribute to dental problems, grinding the teeth.
And things like that. But so you touched on mental health, that's another issue, right? So if we had high quality access or just even access to healthcare, because the interesting part, Utah has a great healthcare system. Whether it's University of Utah, IHC, we have good healthcare in the state. So if we could have the insurance in place so those children could go there and get that health care, the results would be phenomenal. We'd be addressing some of these issues. So I'll swerve a little bit here. We have the highest rate of teenage suicide per capita in the country.
Utah?
Utah.
That's terrifying.
Highest rate per capita in the country. Why? And that, I'm throwing that out as a general question because we don't know the answer, right? Some people will say now there's studies being done living at altitude causes depression. So, okay, that's a possibility. Then why did we have a cluster of suicides at Harriman High School?
It was terrible last year, the number of them at Harriman.
And the number's higher than what was publicized because the kids that went
before,
to
it's a difficult thing to cover, for the news to cover, to report societally. It's one of those things that we don't want to emphasize. Nobody wants to see. When it is reported, we see it as kind of a statistic.
But here's an interesting piece to that, which I've just been following. So Copper Hills High School, I think it was like 5 years ago, had a small cluster, and small by Harriman standards. Like there was 3 suicides.
Near to mine, southwest corner of the valley.
But there was like 3 suicides that year, and they brought in a new principal, and they hadn't had a suicide since. That principal is now at Harriman, as of last year. There has not been a suicide at Harriman.
What do they attribute it to?
He's changing the culture. Culture is part of it, right? Like, how are we doing things? He's putting in programs. So he has, I forget the name of it, but People Magazine, of all things, just did a story on it because they train students to be student leaders in the building that are identified. They wear an orange shirt in the beginning so that students know they have somebody to call that knows where the resources are. So the reason I bring up the issue of teen suicide, it's a lot of these issues are starting at a very young age. There are identifiers that we can find at young ages. Here's another thing. There's a thing called the ACEs test. And if you look it up, it's actually really interesting. So they call it a test. It's 8 questions. And if you answer positive to 3 of those questions, the probability of you having depression or suicidal thoughts goes up exponentially. And it's
3 questions.
3 out of the 8. And it's questions like, were you in a home where there was domestic violence? Were you in a home where there was addiction? Were you in the home where there was abject poverty? Right? So how about if we even took a program like that and said, let's just start measuring a baseline. Forget about privacy issues and everything. Don't put your name on it to start. But let's have every high school just have that put out to the students.
They're all going to have more than 3 of the 8.
Maybe, maybe not. But the thing is, now you have a principal that can say, I know the temperature of my building. I know we have issues in this building. Maybe there's a self-awareness. The student will say, maybe I should go and talk to somebody because I did have 3 of those, right? But now we're starting to be proactive and saying, we know we have a problem. We don't know the answers right now because we don't. I mean, I wish we could say we knew the answer why young children are harming themselves, right? We don't yet. But we need to have the medical systems in place, the insurance in place, and the support systems in place. So when they do have this, here's another one. This just happened to a friend of my daughter's. She was going to a therapist in Park City. The therapist moves. She had developed a great relationship with her. So if she wants to teleconference with that therapist, who's still in Utah, but it's about an hour drive where she relocated, insurance won't pay for the teleconference. If she goes to the hour drive and meets with her, they'll pay for it.
That's insanity. Goes back to your earlier point about the changing face of education, too, and it being done online now instead of the old brick and mortar.
Well, think about this. We have what they're called now, they're calling them healthcare deserts around the country, right? So there's no primary healthcare within 100 miles of where you live. We have those all over Utah. So if we're not going to start covering teleconference and telehealth. My wife just had a friend visiting from Seattle. She works for the VA. The VA hospitals are incorporating telehealth because so many of the veterans are living in these rural areas that they went back to but need the services. But all these small community facilities are closing down because of cost. We better come up with a new way to reach these people or we're going to have ongoing problems.
Yeah, and we all see the veterans as part of the homeless population on the street. We're breeding a new generation of future warriors, and hopefully we can mold them a little differently from the lessons that we've learned, Mo. And I've learned a few here today. I appreciate you coming on. Wish you all of the success that is possible to you. I love the 5-star connection, the New York connection, and I'll give you the final word.
Well, just thanks for having me. We want to, at Voices, we really want to get the word out to the community. I think there's a lot of misinformation. I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done. And also, when you touch on the veterans at the end, it reminded me, we make too many things a zero-sum game anymore in this society. I've seen people posting, before we take care of this, we need to take care of the veterans, or before we take care of this, we need to take care of this. Yeah. We can take care of both. That's the other thing. We constantly hear what a great economy Utah has and what a great direction the state's heading in, which I agree with. So
they can afford to put their money where the mouth is.
Exactly.
Right?
And if we have to call it this, and I don't like saying we have to invest in our children, and we have to have an ROI on our children, but if we have to, fine. Let's invest the money where we know we're going to get a return on it long term, and the real return is for the children. They're the ones that are going to benefit from it.
Now, I know you're from the 70s. In the horror movies in the 70s, those kids turned and killed us, right? If we don't take care of them, it's going to be a horror
you have
movie.
your zombie sign up there. They'll come back and get us. Yeah. So, no, I think, and one of the things is, the fundamental value in Utah that I've always heard is that you put a little bit aside for the next generation. You look out for the next generation. This is an opportunity for us to do that. We're so young here, and we can reap so many rewards if we put that time and effort into it now and the investment into it, that Utah could be a model state. We really could.
Yeah, I agree. Well said. I'll leave it at that. Running over the commercial, 6:01. Thank you for listening, folks. Drive safe, drive time. I'll be back next week with a surprise guest. Not sure yet. Talk with Ted. Mo, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Have a great evening. Drive safe. We'll see you next week.